So it's often like 3-4 months later,
Yeah.
we're matching a shot exactly light-wise that we did 3 or 4 months, before. And it's one thing to match a shot like that you're cutting to, but it's another thing to match a shot that is literally the same shot, that you're looking at the same shot at the same time.
Welcome to the Film Riot podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Conley, and today on the show we have Jody Lee Lipes, who is an incredible cinematographer that has worked on films like A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, Manchester by the Sea, Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene, and most recently with the HBO series, I Know This Much Is True, which is an absolutely incredible show. You'll hear me gush over it a bit in this episode, but it's no lie. This is absolutely one of my favorite short-run series to come out in a very, very long time. It really is brilliant from top to bottom, from the writing, directing, to obviously the cinematography. It's a really brilliant show. So if you have not watched it, definitely check that out. It's on HBO right now. But Jody has a lot to say about his process of cinematography and working within that realm, especially on the show. We talk a lot about that, including about how they handled the twinning in the show, which is probably the best that I've personally ever seen it. But before we get into all of that, I did want to thank our sponsor, which today's sponsor is Music Bed, which I've talked about Music Bed a ton. I've talked about it on this show. I've talked about it on our YouTube show, Film Riot. It's a platform that I use all the time because it does suck to get bogged down in the edit while you're trying to track down the perfect song for your film or whatever your project is. And I've been there plenty of times. So has the people at Music Bed. In fact, that's the entire reason that they built their platform. They've made it easier than ever for you to find the songs that you're looking for with intuitive and easy to use browse and search. All the amazing indie artists and bands and incredible composers like Ryan Talbert and Chad Lawson. The roster is growing every day too, with over 20,000 songs ranging from cinematic and electronic to indie rock and hip hop, and with either single song licenses or subscriptions that give you unlimited downloads. There's something for every type of filmmaker here. So to create your free account and learn more, go to musicbed.com. Plus, as a Film Riot listener, they're giving you 1 month of subscription for free or 20% off of a single song license. Just enter the coupon code Film Riot when you check out. But now, with all of that out of the way, I'm going to jump right into it with Jody. And a place I like to start with everyone is, I find it really interesting to know, what was the moment you realized you wanted to be a filmmaker?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think there really was a moment, but I definitely remember when I was very young that my dad used to photograph and videotape things a lot.
Yeah.
And so it was like when I got to a certain age, I started to do that too. And so I don't know that I, considered that filmmaking at the time, but I was kind of like compulsively documenting things on a video camera from, like in my teens.
Sure.
And even now, like if there's something I feel like I want to remember, I just quickly take out my phone and take a picture of it, hoping that in the future I'll remember what I was thinking when I took the picture.
Yeah.
When I see it again. So I guess maybe that was the first time I was doing something about it, but I would definitely not call that like being a filmmaker, but making stuff. And I think also just, watching movies a lot to an extent that was like, I didn't realize how much I was doing it, but I was definitely doing it more than most people when I was really young, and still do. And so I think that too is sort of like the seed of eventually making things.
Sure. Did you end up going to film school, or you just kind of made your path a different way?
Yeah, I did. I when I was in high school, I was in we had like a art requirement. And so I took painting and drawing. Like my dad is a painter. And so I had sort of grown up drawing a lot and stuff. And so I took that class, but I didn't really enjoy it very much. And I felt like I had conflict with the teacher and stuff. And then they started this video class in my high school. And I thought like, oh, well, I'll take that instead. And then I don't have to take that other class. That was kind of like the origin of it. And then that led to me getting kind of like more and more serious about it in high school and applying to film school. And then I ended up going to NYU for film.
Nice. Were you making like short films and stuff with friends in high school, or was it more just sort of documenting?
Yeah. I was for school, like for assignments. I would do that. And even I remember even in other classes when we had an like if we had a group assignment or something of like to do a project about something, I would sort of try to make it into like a filmmaking project rather
Yeah,
than
same.
like any other kind of presentation. And yeah, I guess it kind of became the other thing I was mentioning before is just kind of like documenting all the time. You know, like my friends would be over at my house and I would just kind of like film everything all the time.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you went to film school, and did you get your first sort of industry job right out of film school? What was your first actual, what you would consider your actual kind of leg into the industry to get you on the path you're at now?
Well, I think the first like real movie that I was a part of was a Todd Solondz film called Palindromes.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, I don't know if do you remember that movie?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So like my understanding was that, you know, he had just done Storytelling, which I think was his first studio film since I think his very first movie. And it was kind of bigger and more expensive. And then a big chunk of it got taken out by the studio. It sort of went from being like 3 stories to being 2. And so I think that whole experience was not super positive for him. And then he came back to do Palindromes, his next film, on a much, much, much smaller scale. And it was produced by Mike Ryan and Derek Singh, who are 2 great producers. And they sort of came up with the idea of using interns to do a lot of things that they normally don't do. So I went in to interview for it because my roommate, Lance Edmonds, who's a filmmaker at the time, had gone in and told me about it, and he was going to try and be a producer's assistant. So I went to go talk to Mike Ryan, the producer, and he was like, "Oh, you know stuff about cameras? Okay, you should go. You should meet with the DP." And that kind of like, I ended up being the loader for the film, and then I ended up being an electrician for the second half of the film. So I really get to see like, oh, this is how grown-ups make a feature film. And I didn't know any of that stuff before then. And that was, I think, between my second and third year of college.
Oh, wow. So that was during college.
Yeah. That was like an internship I did during college where I paid NYU to get credits to work for free on a Todd Solondz movie, which is ridiculous in retrospect. But yeah, so that was like definitely the biggest educational experience I had at NYU, which was outside of NYU. And yeah, so that was the first time I saw that. But then in terms of like getting a job, I think, you know, a couple of my friends were making feature length projects a few years or like a year or 2 out of school. One was Matt Wolf, who's a documentary director who just made the film Spaceship Earth about the biosphere. I don't know if you saw that film.
I haven't seen it yet, but I have heard of it.
Yeah, so he's a great documentary director, and his first feature was about a musician named Arthur Russell who died of AIDS in the 90s. And so all of our friends from school just sort of like helped him make that film one piece at a time between like, I think 2006 and 2000, or maybe 2005, 2007, which is when it came out. And so that was like the first feature length thing. And then my other friend Antonio Campos made a movie called After School, and he asked me to be the DP on that. So that was the first like feature length scripted narrative film that I had shot. And I had made a feature length documentary around that time for myself. I was working like a little bit in lighting kind of, and shooting weddings every once in a while to make a living. But then my first like job was this little tiny TV show called The Whitest Kids You Know, which was on IFC, and I think Comedy Central at one point, or Fuse or something. I can't even remember. But yeah, I was a part of that. And that was like, that felt like the first like job I had, where there was like, I went in and I interviewed for it with like adults and they hired me to do it. So yeah, that was probably my first job.
Yeah, I remember that show. My friends and I were addicted to that for a bit.
Yeah.
One of your first films that I personally saw made me be like, wow, who is this? Was Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene. I loved that film. And the visual language of that film really connected with me. How did that specific film come about? Because that was far more indie, and that was a little bit early on, I believe, right, for you? So how did that one come about?
Well, so when the year after I graduated from NYU, someone reached out to me about shooting a student film, and I was kind of like, I think sort of stupidly and arrogantly kind of like, I don't want, I'm not going to do like student films anymore. And I kind of like brush it off. But they kept sort of reaching out to me. And finally I was like, you know what, fine. I'll like call this guy. And they got on the phone with the director, Sean Durkin, who I think is, one of the best directors I've ever worked with. And so like I ended up shooting his final student film called Doris with Rosemary Durrett and Paul Sparks. And that was like, oh wow, these guys are really serious and they like the kinds of movies I like, and they're really into like Michael Haneke and all these sort of European auteurs. And it turned out that the producer of that short film, Antonio Campos, had also just, one of his student films had won, the shorts division or the student division of the Cannes Film Festival that year. So these three guys were called Borderland Films. It was Sean Durkin, Antonio Campos, and Josh Mond. And they were all like sort of had a really strong connection and really helped each other out. And they ended up making the first few features that I shot. Antonio's first feature, After School, that I mentioned earlier, was that first film. And I think he was 24 and I was 25. And then that first feature ended up being in the In Certain Regard section of Cannes. And so that was like a great sort of entrance for me that the first film I worked on was in this very prestigious film festival. And
yeah, not bad.
yeah, it was a good start. And I was very, really proud of that. And so Sean Durkin, who had made the short Doris that Antonio produced, and then Antonio's first feature, After School, I shot, and then Sean's first feature was Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene. So like the three of them were kind of producing each other's films. And so Doris turned into After School, turned into another movie called Two Gates of Sleep, which was also in Cannes. And then Martha came after that. So I was kind of just really tight with those guys and working with them. So it was like we were all NYU people, but I didn't meet them until I finished with NYU. I think I was like a year older than a couple of them. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
And like I said, like Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene, and really all your films just for me feel so grounded and just visually just immerses into, theme and emotion so much. And it makes me wonder, a bit about your process. What does prep look like for you? I mean, before ever stepping on set, what do you like to prep and what do you like to leave alone before you're actually physically there ready to shoot?
Yeah, I think so much of preparing to make something as a cinematographer is about who the director is and the way that they work and trying to learn about the way that they work, which I think you can't really, really know until you're on set with someone. But, as I get older, like there are certain cues that I've started to understand more of just, oh, this person is a planner, or this person is afraid of planning, or this person is kind of stifled by planning, or this person needs, they're going to be very, very focused on this thing. And I need to really like figure that out for them to be comfortable. But like this other thing that I really need to figure out, like they don't want to talk about that. So I should just like not worry about that and just let it happen and just let, just sort of you're kind of reacting to their personality and to what's important to them and all of that. But I also, I think there are certain things that you need to express, like we need to figure this out. If we don't figure this out, like these are the things that could happen, and then sort of like put that in their court and let them decide if they really want to like spend energy on that. I think in terms of Martha, for me, I was still in like a big planning phase because with After School, which was the first feature I shot, Antonio and I went through the entire film scene by scene with a video camera and kind of like shot every shot just with the two of us and like a stand-in. And I think he even like kind of had his editor, Zach Stewart Pontier, like actually like cut it together for us so we could kind of like watch like a very, 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 very rough idea of like how it worked visually. And so then when I got to Martha, which I think was the third or fourth feature I had shot, I was kind of still in that mode. And I didn't realize at the time that I think it was actually making Sean uncomfortable because he didn't really want to make all of those decisions ahead of time. I think he wanted to kind of like respond to what was happening in a rehearsal or on set more. But I think the positive thing that came out of that, which was that I think a really important overarching visual concept in Martha is that, there are these two different worlds. It's a story about a woman who is in a cult and escapes and returns to live with her older sister, who doesn't know that she was living in a cult. So while she's living with her sister, she keeps sort of remembering her life in this cult. And as she remembers more and more, and as the audience sees more and more of her past with this cult, she starts to kind of conflate her current reality living with her sister with the past that she's just escaped from, to the point where she is actually confused about what's happening now and what she's remembering. And so visually speaking, it was really important to emphasize that emotion of that protagonist by putting them in the mind space of that character. So there are times when you are transitioning between scenes in the cult in the past and scenes in the present where you don't want the audience to know where you are. You want them to be confused about whether they are still in the past or whether they're in the present, just like she is. And so for that reason, you're having to carefully plan those transitional moments so that they bleed together in a way that's not immediately clear to the audience where you are. And so because I kind of emphasize the importance of kind of pretending that we knew exactly what the edit was going to be, and pretending that we knew exactly how the film was going to piece together later, it helped those transitions work really well and confuse the audience, so that they could kind of feel how the protagonist was also confused and sort of spiraling. So, that's a situation where I think it was good that I kind of went against, I think, what Sean was feeling. And I think another example of that would be, and I know this much is true, the final scene of episode 1 when Thomas is admitted to the forensic hospital and there's that long oneer that's handheld. And, Derek Zanfranz, the director, is very much against the idea of rehearsing. But because of the complexity of that, we actually took a whole day just to rehearse that scene and make sure, it would feel right and that the actors were sort of leading the camera rather than the other way around, and that the visual effects would all work because of the twinning elements in that show. And that actually worked really well. So it's kind of you have to know when to kind of just go with the flow and react to what a director wants and what makes them comfortable, and when you should sort of push back and kind of put them in a situation which they wouldn't put themselves in without you, to help them get to where they want to go eventually.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like your relationship with pre-production and the director pretty much shifts every time, like you said, because of the director. Are there any commonalities between every production that you kind of take to pre-production with dealing with the director, or things that you ask up front that you find paramount to the process?
I don't know. I think the older I've gotten, the more I've sort of laid down, and I think in a good way. I think in a way where it's sort of putting my ego aside and saying I trust this person, I care about this person, and I'm going to let them lead this process, or let my idea of how they want to do this lead the process.
Yeah.
So no, I can't really say there's any commonality between any of the films I've done. I mean, I do certain things on my own, just sort of to prepare, but sometimes it's more useful than others. I kind of I sort of obsessively break down the script in a way where I basically every single scene, to me, I make sort of a Bible for each film, or I have done that for the last 2 or 3 films, where I break down each scene in order by first rewriting each scene so that it is no more than 1 sentence long. And I make sure that all of the key information is in that sentence, and also that it really distills why I think it's important that it's in the movie.
Yeah.
So I can actually kind of really agonize over the wording of those sentences and spend a lot of time writing them. And then I have this it's almost like cliff notes where, a lot of the time when you're working on a feature, or especially I know this much is true, which is a however many, like, was that 400-page long script, right? And like people get super lost, you're location scouting where it's like, oh, what happens here? Everybody's like, oh, well, there's that scene number 312. And then people like quickly like try to scan it. And it's really hard to, it's like if you see a scene that's 2 pages long and you kind of scan it like quickly,
Yeah.
you're going to miss stuff. But for me, I just open my phone, like my Google Drive or whatever, and I have a document and I can find that scene in like a quarter of a second. And then I can read the whole scene in one sentence.
That's great.
And so like, that's my way of kind of being really on top of that, because it's so easy to forget where you are and what came before and what came after and all that, you're exhausted and you're, 100 days into shooting and it's like, okay, this is the scene that we're doing today. And it's so easy to not look at the scene before and the scene after. And that's such an important thing to do. And it's so easy to not have the energy to do it. So it kind of distills that. And then I'll like pull relevant images for a particular scene, which sometimes it's like for the gaffer, and sometimes it's for the camera assistant, sometimes it's for the director, sometimes it's for the production designer. And I'll know what those are, and I will share this big document with anyone in case they care. Usually they don't, but it's a quick way for me to kind of tell them like, oh yeah, so like in this scene and that thing I sent you, like there's this picture, and the reason why I included that is because X, Y, and Z. And then I took like this video with my phone that I think is kind of like maybe what that shot might be like, and it's embedded in that document. So like you can check that. And so, yeah, it's kind of like I do that, but then like usually I will stop referencing it completely at a certain point in the film. But like I have it there in case I need it, and I have it there as a way of like digesting the film really quickly again after I've read it 50
sort of
times.
A safety net as you continue on.
Yeah. It's like a shorthand, and it's a sort of creative document, and it's something that it just physically like building it in a computer, it really like makes you learn the script, and it makes you learn, and if you're using like multiple formats or something, it's like, well, a lot of the time people are like, well, wait, what scene is this scene on this camera or on the other one? Or like, are we using these lenses for this? And so if you like color code the whole thing, it's like a quick way to communicate to people, like, it's in that document, like that's the scene number, check it. If it's pink, that means we're using this or whatever, so it's a way to kind of like communicate a little bit more easily.
Yeah, that's a really great, I love that, dialing each scene down to a sentence. Sounds like something that is great advice for writers and directors too. Like, I feel like that's something that I'm going to start using, because, when you're writing a script, and I know you write as well. I saw that you've got 2 films coming, which you're a writer on. You get a little bit lost in the grand scope of things when you're first building it. So I love that idea of just one sentence of, I imagine that would help so much find those things that, this doesn't need to be here. And remove them or alter them.
Yeah. And it's also super embarrassing because like, if for me to like summarize what I think a scene is about, and then have the person who wrote it or who's been living with it for 5 years, and I've been on the project for, 3 months or whatever, to see it and be like, that's wrong. But that's also good, because then it like makes them tell you why, if they're kind enough to tell you why.
Yeah.
And then that can be like a whole other conversation of like, oh, okay, like this is what this means to you. This is what, and now I see how this puzzle piece like fits into the film. And like, I've always felt it's a little bit silly, but I also think it's a little bit true. Like, if there's an issue with the writing, it's hard to know where to put the camera. And,
interesting.
Like, I think that at the end of the day, if there's like a real perspective to it and a real consistency to it, like the camera kind of like knows where it wants to go to a certain extent. And if there isn't, it's easy to fall into a more generic approach to what you're shooting, because you don't really have a really specific thing you're trying to show with the camera. Like, I remember on After School, the first feature film that I shot for Antonio Campos, the first feature film I shot, period. I remember there was a really important scene where, the film takes place at a really fancy private school in Connecticut, and all these very privileged kids who are very protected, the rich kids are really protected by their parents and all this stuff. And I remember there's this scene where the protagonist's roommate comes back from being at home over the weekend, and he's brought some like cocaine back to school or something. And the cocaine is going to become like a very big story point. And so he sort of arrives back in the dorm and has this whole conversation with his roommate, the protagonist. And Tony wanted the scene to be shot as just a close up of the backpack on the bed, and you just hear them off screen. And then later in the film, you realize, oh, in that backpack was this cocaine, and that cocaine did X, Y, and Z. And that's how all this happened. But the first time you're watching it, you're kind of like, why are we looking at this backpack? And then it's resolved later. And there was a handful of scenes I think he really ingeniously like crafted that way. And to me, that's really good writing. And then that writing informs the visual in a big way. And also the sort of boldness of choosing to tell a story that way and having the comfort and the confidence to kind of approach it that way and commit to that, and that giving that a really specific perspective, I think is awesome. So that's kind of an example of how I think that actually like physically manifests.
And so was staying on the backpack that was specifically in the script, or was that just in his prep?
I don't think it was. I think it was like when we were planning out the film, he was like, okay, so like in this scene, I think it's like just on the backpack, and not in a way where he like thinks it's cool or he's trying to be like, a maestro or like distracting the audience. It's like to him, like that's where the story is, So no, I don't think the camera direction was written into the script in that case. No, it was just in his brain.
Gotcha. Well, we talked a little bit about I know this much is true, and I want to dive into that because it's excellent. It's one of the best shows I've seen, and I'm not just saying that because I'm talking to you. I've had plenty of people on the show. I just think it's fantastic. Especially visually, and how emotionally immersive it is visually was really striking to me. So I want to talk a bunch about that, and maybe starting off with the look is really beautiful. Could you talk about how you and Derek decided on that specific look and how you ended up getting it?
Yeah, I think with Derek, who, is definitely one of my heroes, I think it all comes out of his feeling that the actors and the performances and the story lead a film. And like, he really means that. He really practices that. So the environment of the set and the working method are all really geared like a whole world that is not interrupted by equipment or limitations or things like marks or rehearsals. It's all just sort of like happening as it happens, and we're kind of responding to that and just capturing it. And so for that reason, Derek, that sort of informed the tools that we're going to use. So the first thing was that Derek felt film was the right choice for this project. And I totally agree. And is that, the time period of the film is 1913 through the early 90s. So, film is the format of that entire period of time. And so like, I think I always make a choice if I'm doing a period film, like, am I making this look like the past? Am I trying to evoke a feeling of the past by the way it's photographed? Or am I trying to make it look like now, even though in the story it is the past, as a way to comment on the now by looking at the past? So I think in this case, we both agreed we wanted to feel like the past visually. And at this point, film is not the most common tool that people use, and it does evoke the past. And so because it covered that whole time period, we felt like that was the best choice. And we also felt that, and Derek very early on brought this idea that, the whole story is one story. It shouldn't feel different in the 50s. It shouldn't feel different in the teens. It shouldn't feel different in the 20s. It's all one story, and it should have a visual consistency throughout, because it's about one family and the actions and how they sort of percolate down through the generations, and how character traits kind of like are passed on and all that. So there's sort of a unity to the entire story, even though it jumps around and intercuts dramatically in time. Yeah, so we felt one tool, one format, and the format that we felt showed the time period best was film. And so then it's sort of like, well, what kind of film and what's the aspect ratio and all that kind of stuff. And so because of the working method that Derek likes, and because of sort of putting the actors first, he's all about 2perf, which is, shooting a, 35 millimeter, but in a particular way where the running time is much longer. So you get like 22 and a half minutes per magazine, or you can sort of roll continuously for 22 and a half minutes before you have to stop, basically.
Right.
And so 2perf became sort of the format of choice. Then, we had a limitation, which is that HBO was limiting us to no wider than 2:1. So we couldn't go to sort of traditional widescreen, which I think all of Derek's films have been. We were a little bit less wide than that. And because 2perf is natively a very, very wide aspect ratio, it's even wider than widescreen, we had to like cut off a bunch of the sides and then zoom in on it more to make it the correct aspect ratio for HBO.
Oh, so that's why it gave you kind of a little bit more of a 16 mil look.
Yes. Yeah. So it's like grainier, it's like softer. I think it helps make it like age it a little bit because it's sort of less kind of polished looking. And so that was really like, that limitation turned out to be a real blessing because it's an unusual, I'm sure there is one, but I can't think of an example of a film that was shot 2perf and finished 2:1. So it's a unique aspect ratio for this format. It's a unique sort of negative area, like the amount of film that you're using in each frame is unique to this project. And so there's that. And then we also, to sort of further emphasize this sort of organic period feel of the film, I also just underexposed it a lot and sort of like starved the film negative. So it's like grainier and kind of like muddier and softer. And yeah, so like all those things together gave it that look. And then we just chose lenses that we thought were kind of like not too stylized, because we felt like just the film look and the way it was graded, the color of it, were enough. And that really was like the sort of jumping off point for like, this is how the film looks and feels. And then there's like many other choices beyond that, but that was kind of like the starting point.
That's so great, man. Yeah. And I love how much the visuals really amplified the characters and the family and the difficulties and what they were going through. It's just, like you said, it was so unified, so perfectly the way you guys did it. And, speaking of, it being unified, it does feel that way. And I was really taken by the flashbacks and how it jumped, and it still, like you said, felt so unified. And just across the board with the series as a whole, were there a set of rules that you guys set up before starting that you held throughout production to keep that unity? Like, never do this, we only do this type stuff?
There was a lot of rules, there's a lot of ideas, and there was a lot of contradicting those rules and contradicting those ideas. And I mean that in a good way. I think, Derek was really, he sort of found a way to get me really excited about these things that I would, in sort of anybody else's hands, feel kind of like bummed out about. So it was like, no dolly allowed. The camera does not dolly in the show. So you're limited to, like, camera movements are limited to pans and tilts. There's no like vertical movement, so the camera doesn't like boom. So like there's a very limited way to move the camera, but I think Derek found a way to really excite me about that. So that was one thing. And I think that again sort of comes from the idea of like not wanting the actors to feel hemmed in by the technical things around them. It's like if you do a dolly shot, most of the time what you have to do is put track downs as kind of like railroad tracks, right? And you lay them on the floor.
Yeah.
And so, for the actor to walk over the tracks is awkward and unnatural. And it also kind of like, even if you don't say anything to them about where they should go, it is kind of like subliminally telling them like, well, so the camera can move on this axis, so you're sort of like needing to respond to that, as opposed to being, in the corner of the room on kind of a long lens and just following whatever they do. And a dolly track, again, is sort of like making them feel they're supposed to travel in a specific way and do that again and again and again as you do more and more takes. But again, if you're like in the corner of a room just on a long lens, there doesn't need to be any consistency from take to take. They can go wherever they want, and there's nothing telling them that they shouldn't.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, I think it kind of comes from that. And, just a real simplicity. One of the films we looked at together was a movie called Three Times, which is directed by Hao Xiaoxian. And this sequence in a pool hall where the entire thing is shot from one place. Sometimes they change like the focal length, so it's a little bit tighter or wider, but like everything is shot from this one corner of the room and the camera never moves. And so Derek was really excited about that. It's like, well, look, like you don't have to do anything. Like the camera is just here. And then like we can go to a longer lens if we want to get closer to somebody, but like the camera never does anything. It doesn't move at all. It just pans and tilts. And like, look how incredible this scene is. And it's sort of like, it's just the kind of thing that like isn't supposed to work, like grammatically. And you have to kind of get beyond that and say like, you're in the hands of this kind of visual master, and like you just have to trust and get excited about it and get excited about doing something different and then just try it. So there are definitely scenes we did that way, and definitely times we contradicted that in a big way. And yeah, there was a whole bunch of things like that really informed how the show looked.
Yeah, and you mentioned there was no rehearsal, and you're not putting tracks because you don't want to tell the actors where to go. So does that mean there were no marks either?
Yeah, there was no marks, and a lot of the show, I would say maybe like, I would say roughly 50% of it are on very, very big zoom lenses, 2 cameras, no rehearsals, no marks, no consistency between takes. A lot of the times it's like, it's not even that the focus pullers can kind of like learn where people are going to go a lot of the time because they don't always go in the same place. And then we're often like zooming in from sort of like a normal lens to like a very, very long lens, like, which is like a telescope, like a 300 millimeter lens or whatever, for 22.5 minutes, just like as people are kind of like going through the scene multiple times. We don't cut and we're just rolling. And so it was incredibly challenging for the focus pullers. And I think, and also the camera operators, obviously. And that's where I think a lot of the aesthetic of Derek's work comes from is, a lot of people shoot quote unquote, like sort of doc style, like, The Office or something, but it's like to actually really make it feel that way, you have to be in a situation where the operator can't follow it, like where they can't actually like keep it smooth. They can't actually, like the shot is too tight to kind of accommodate what would be considered like a clean camera move. And so that creates this sense of kind of urgency, but also this sense of like it's unfolding in real time as you're photographing it for the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So are you just having to like light almost 360 to some degree just to give them full freedom of that space?
Yeah, as much as possible, Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, there's 2 cameras in the room. So sometimes like, you're not going to be, if one of the cameras is like parked in front of a window, right? Like, that the other camera is not going to like look at that window, right? But like, yes, in large part, yeah, you're trying to light the whole room. And that is a challenge because to me, the dynamic that always creates is like, it's easy to light a whole room. That's not a problem. The problem is like lighting a whole room and making it have shape and character and be interesting and not overlit, and to make it look real. And that's the challenge.
Yeah.
And then in this show, it's sort of compounded by the twinning element, because we're shooting Mark Ruffalo as the one brother Dominic for 17 weeks or whatever it was. And then he takes 6 weeks off while we shoot other stuff, and then comes back for the last several weeks to shoot the other brother, the Thomas side, in those same scenes that we had done at the beginning of the shoot. So it's often like 3-4 months later, we're matching a shot exactly light-wise that we did 3 or 4 months, before. And, it's one thing to match a shot like that you're cutting to, but it's another thing to match a shot that is literally the same shot, that you're looking at the same shot at the same time. So, sort of the lighting 360 and doing that at the same time, and sort of lighting in a way where we're giving ourselves a good chance of being able to reproduce it 3 or 4 months later, that's when it all gets really tricky. But that's also like what's so great about Derek is he just everyone who works with him feels that they are walking on a tightrope and they're just sort of doing the hardest work of their lives and the sort of the most like risky work of their lives. And they're pushing themselves like way out of their comfort zone to, get to where he wants to go.
Yeah.
And it's kind of invigorating and thrilling. It's really frightening and it's very stressful. But basically, like, I think more than on any other project I've ever been on, it was like, okay, so we don't know what's going to happen here. So if you put the camera over there in the corner, like you can see the whole room, right? It's like, yeah, okay, cool. Like, let's do that. And then you can like pan around and see the whole room. And then where should the other one go? Over here. You can't see this part from where that other camera is. So stick it over there.
Right.
And then we'll see what the actors do. We shoot for 22 and a half minutes. And then it's like, oh, he's going to be over by the couch. Okay. And then it's like really quickly try to like, make it so that it's not black on the couch, and we're shooting on film and just make sure there's enough light that, we can see over there and it looks real. And, and then it's like, okay, now we're like, we do that really quickly. And then it's like, now it's time to shoot another 22 and a half minutes. And then Mark doesn't sit on the couch. Now he's in the stair. He's standing on the stairs. And it's like, okay, now we have to go. Oh, okay, like we've got to do the stairs. And so it was that kind of feeling. You're just really like responding, but you kind of can't like stop things. Like things are happening. So you have to take these risks where it's like, you know what? I'm not going to light over there because if I do, it's going to compromise all of this other stuff and it's going to make it much less dramatic. And then up, he went over to that area. So
Right.
it's kind of, if you get too nervous and you kind of do too much, then you're just destroying everything. So you kind of have to be like taking those risks and sometimes failing and sometimes it's a happy accident. But I think, I'm really proud of the way it all looks and the way it worked out. And part of that is just, that Derek is also just a very, very visual filmmaker, even though so much of his emphasis is on performance and story, and that's at the forefront. And he gives people so much freedom. As the day progresses, he kind of like at the end, once he feels like he really knows what the scene is, then he's going to sort of be talking through a take and saying like, oh, take one step to your left, like and in the middle of a shot and sort of making sure it works visually. And Derek is also, has probably done more editing than anything else in his career. And so as an editor, I think he's really in there, like choosing things that work visually too, which not everyone does.
Right.
And so I think that was like a huge help to me too, and made me look much better than I probably should have, because he is caring about that, like in post, which a lot of people don't really put enough energy into, I feel like.
Yeah, 100%. And you brought up the twin aspect, which was just it really blew me away. By far the best I've seen in anything. It was, usually it calls attention to itself to some degree. You see the strings to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
It was never like that for me. It was like, does Mark Ruffalo have a twin?
Right. Yeah.
So what was how did you guys go about that process to make that happen? I mean, I know, and you were even just talking about it. You shot first with Mark and then you took a break while he went and, I believe, gained weight, right? He didn't lose weight for it. He gained weight. Okay. And then he went off and gained weight and then came back and you guys had to reshoot all of those pieces.
Mm-hmm.
How did you keep that together to nail it so perfectly each time? Like, for instance, there's a driving scene, and this one stood out to me. And it was, I believe, episode 1. Actually, they were supposed to go see the mother. They're leaving. He wants to go McDonald's, and the fluidity within that scene just really, struck me. I actually rewound it and watched it twice, just like, am I missing?
Yeah.
So how did you guys go about making sure you nailed every single moment so well?
Well, I think so. In some ways, it's harder because you don't have the actor who's playing both parts, right? But, Gabe Fazio, who is Mark's acting partner, who played the brother opposite the brother that Mark was performing as, is an incredible actor, and it's like the version of the movie that's like Gabe instead of Mark is also great. He's a great actor, and gained the weight and lost the weight, and did all that stuff.
Oh wow! So he was just mirroring him to match body type, even.
Yeah, he was great. Like full on. Yeah, and so you have these two people as two great actors, and they're on set, and I think the key is to shoot it like it's two people, because it is, and there's two people there. There literally are two people there. And to not let the technology, whether it's like motion control or like, head replacement limitations and all those things, like limit the way that you're thinking about telling the story. Like the story should be told the way it should be told. And like, of course you should have like a basic understanding of, the limitations of the tools you're using, but really you should be like freeing yourself and saying like, okay, so I know that if we shoot it this way, there are these problems with head replacement, but like, what can we do about that? Like, let's say we are going to shoot it this way. Like, how can we make it work? Instead of being kind of like afraid of the potential consequences. So I think we started off with a lot of fear and kind of like in prep trying to think of it as like avoiding twinning, and using Heat as an example of that idea where, De Niro and Pacino in Michael Mann's Heat are never seen, their faces are never seen on screen together. They're like two sides of a coin.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the initial idea, but then it was like, you know what, just the way I can see the way Derek works, it's never going to be that controlled. And we're never going to really know what the shots are and be able to like really like adhere to something that strict. So we started to kind of break out of that. And yeah, and it's just all about trying to think of it as if it's not a twinning movie, really. That's kind of the key.
Yeah.
And to not, and I think the weight obviously is a huge thing, because like, as Derek always says, it's like whenever he watches a twinning movie, it's like, oh, well, they shot the one side and then they went to lunch and, the guy put on a fake mustache and then that now they're doing the other side, and you can like feel that, and it's distracting when you're watching a movie. Derek did everything possible to make that not the case, including like when we were working with Phil Ettinger, who plays the younger version of Mark Ruffalo's character. We would shoot back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so there wasn't just sort of like, okay, now we're doing Dominic. Now, okay, later we're going to do Thomas. It was like you're doing both of them at the same time. And you're like, they're responding to, Phil is responding to what he did in the last take on the other side.
Oh, wow.
And so there's just, he had all sorts of like tricks for not being like limited by the way people normally do that thing. And then the other really big thing was we had a 1 week hiatus, and Derek went in with his editors and they looked at the twinning scenes before we shot the Thomas side. And then we had a big meeting where we watched these sort of cuts of these scenes before going to shoot the Thomas side, and talked about like what shots we needed to complete these scenes. Whereas like on the A side, we had shot it in this really sort of like crazy out of control way, never, always shooting a full mag and not using motion control in this sort of restrained way that people often do, and being really free with it. And then going into the edit, we were able to sort of like isolate and kind of like get more specific about like what the scene might actually be, like what the shape of the scene will be.
Right.
And then we were able to kind of like get really a more specific idea about what we need to cover on the Thomas side. So that helped too with kind of the seamlessness of it. I think usually you're in a situation where you're shooting both of those things on the same day, right? But in this case, at least for the Mark stuff, there was time to like cut it and then go back and photograph almost like a reshoot of something where you're honing in more on like making it feel the way you want it to feel after watching the edit and after working with the footage.
Right. That's really interesting. And was there anything, just working with that twinning aspect, was there a specific moment that was more difficult, or a specific thing with that was the most difficult to kind of, get through?
And in terms of just like the technical stuff of twinning, you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I think probably the hardest thing about it is the lighting from a DP's perspective, because you have to be so meticulous about recording what you photographed initially, which is also, again, changing from take to take. right? Because you're adjusting things from take to take. So it's like, okay, wait, were we matching this to take 3 from 4 months ago of this setup? And what are the notes for that? And how do we get that like exactly right? Like, how do we balance this light exactly? Even though the sun is in a totally different position because it's a different season, or like now it's sunny and before it was overcast. And how do you kind of really precisely get back there? And so that was something, you know, with Ken Shibata, the gaffer, and Johnny Herbs Chan, the key grip, that like they really helped me to perfect that as much as possible, and like advised me on how we could kind of like put ourselves in the best position to be able to repeat it later. But then there's a lot of stuff that's just totally out of your control. Like you mentioned that car scene, you know, when we shot that on the A side, there were leaves on the trees and it was overcast. And when we came back to shoot it on the B side, there's, you know, a lot less leaves on the trees and it was sunny.
Right.
And so it's kind of like, yeah, it's really, there's a lot of things you can do to like massage it and make it less noticeable. And obviously with like visual effects help with the background and everything. But yeah, it's all about like taking good notes and being precise, which is just so anti Derek. But it's in this situation, it's kind of like, okay, now we're kind of like cleaning this up. Like this is like the part where we come in and clean it up.
Yeah.
But also trying to obviously be mindful of the fact that Mark is giving like this really powerful performance.
Yeah.
So
God, he was so good in it.
Yeah.
That's kind of amazing. I didn't even think about the fact that you guys are shooting outside a bit. In totally different months and making it match perfectly.
Yeah, it was tricky. And, you know, like a location like that, the driving scene, that's on a highway. So it's like closing that down on a particular day. It's not something like you could just wake up in the morning and be like, yeah, you know what, the sun's out, let's do this next week.
Right.
And also because it's the end of the schedule, there's less malleability to the schedule as you get closer to the end. So yeah, so that was like, okay, today's the day. We're doing it today.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. You know, I was able to, you know, in episode 6, I don't know if you've watched the whole thing yet, but in episode 6, the brothers go to this cemetery that we've seen before in the film and on their way to the waterfall. And that's a very long panning sort of like full body shot of both brothers, like walking through a lot of the cemetery. And that was kind of like, wait. Okay, there's a cloud in front of the sun. Like go. And or like grips carrying big sort of diffusion frames over Thomas and trying to like follow him when they needed to. And or like trying to shoot parts of that scene on the extreme end of or beginning of the day, so that we knew that even if the sun was out, as opposed to being overcast the first time we were there, even if the sun was out, it would be low enough that there would be no direct light. So it would be easier to match. So there's just sort of like tricks like that you can do, but it takes a lot of patience and it takes a lot of, I don't know what the word is, but just like Derek and the producers need to care a lot to kind of like let me control the schedule in that way, and have faith that like, okay, well, if we wait until like the very end of the day to shoot this scene and it's like the last day of the shoot and we don't get it, like what's going to happen, you know, and just trusting like we need to do this or it's not going to feel right, you know? So that was huge that I had all of those people who are more important than me and get paid more money than I do to kind of like to back me up and care about it. It's unusual to have that support.
Yeah, well, it worked, man. It came out absolutely incredible. And, you know, that moving away from the twinning thing, just to the visual language of the film and how much for me, every shot just, you know, immersed you emotionally into what was happening with the character and the story as a whole. Is there something, you know, the psychology of what you're doing as far as lens choices and things like that? Is there anything specifically that you're thinking about? Or at this point, is it more instinctual, you know, what lens you're reaching for or where you're suggesting the camera go?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of it is instinctual at this point, but it's also like, you know, I think Derek, again, about like the environment on set, it's kind of like he would say this thing like, I don't, you know, if we're doing, let's say a shot in a car where one character is in the driver's seat and one character is in the passenger seat in the front. And you put the camera in the front passenger seat to shoot the driver in the front seat. He would say something like, I don't trust that. And that's because the camera is physically where the other actor is supposed to be, right? So it's kind of like physically impossible kind of feeling if you really think about it, and if you're like sensitive to that. And so then it's like, okay, well, if you put the camera in the back seat, then like both of those people could be there. And like, this is more of like the reality of the situation. And I think the same goes for like putting the camera really close to an actor in certain situations. It's kind of like it's blocking their view. Obviously like in the Revenant is incredibly beautiful and, was made by master filmmakers. But like there are times when as a viewer, it almost feels like Leonardo DiCaprio is trying to like avoid looking into the camera. Right. That's like a very extreme version of that. And so I think Derek is kind of like the opposite extreme of that, where it's like you need to like avoid that feeling at all costs. And so I think that informs lens choice. It's not about me being like, this is a cool lens. It's about like following the environment that Derek is trying to create on the set. And I think zooming became a really big part of the language. And I think, that tool can be very effective in kind of like drawing attention to something or giving something additional weight, or sort of like trying to get inside a character's head, making you try to think about what they're thinking about or like what the meaning of this is. But I think it can also get too heavy on top of something that's already very heavy. And so I think that's a reason to say, okay, this scene is primes because it's sort of too dramatic and we don't need to add to it. You know what I mean? So there are decisions like that, but I think less so like, this is like a 32, this is a 35. Like that's something like that I feel and that Sam Ellison, our camera operator, feels and Derek feels, but it's not like there was like a rule, like we, like Amelie or something, where it's like, okay, well, this is a close-up, so we use the 32 at this height and, all that stuff. I think it was more instinctual than that.
Yeah. And it worked great. I mean, I guess that makes a lot of sense to why it, so much gives me the feeling of, I'm in the room with these people watching this, really take place right in front of me.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense with the, if the camera's not going where an actor is, then they're really there. And I'm just in the backseat watching this happen.
Yeah. And it also, the other thing is, Derek is constantly like, okay, well, this is the shot, and then we're shooting it, and it's like, we're in the middle of rolling. It's like, actually, no, pan over here. And like, it gives you, I think it does a couple things. One is it makes the actors feel like there is no off-screen time. Like they don't know when they're on screen and when they're not. And so they always have to be on. Right. And so it creates that environment for them. It creates that environment for the whole crew of like being on edge and like waiting to like spring into action.
That's great.
At all times, and like being like sharp at all times. But it also, I think, creates more of like a feeling that like it's really happening, because you can look anywhere at any time and it's really happening. And if the camera is in a place it's not supposed to be, then like you're limiting how you can just like surf around and try to find things. So yeah, I think it creates that feeling too.
Big thank you to Jody for taking the time to talk with us about all of that. And as always, you can go to filmriot.com/podcast, find the episode page for this episode, and you'll find more links of where to find Jody online, including a trailer for I Know This Much Is True and some of his other work. Of course, you can find me online at twitter.com/Ryan_Connolly. And if you dug this episode or any of our other episodes, consider subscribing, rating, leaving a comment. All that stuff really does help us out quite a bit. And until next time, don't forget to write, shoot, edit, repeat.